Back in 2018, AMD really impressed with their Ryzen CPUs with iGPUs, excellent performance for a pretty reasonable price. All the way down on the list of AM4 CPUs with Vega graphics, you could find the Athlon 200GE, a $50 CPU meant to compete with the G4560 from Intel. Even back in the day, the CPU wasn't really a powerhouse. With only 2 cores and 4 threads wasn't something to brag about. After 5 years, the number of cores and threads on this CPU is something you wouldn't really dare to recommend to anyone who wants to do some serious tasks. Regardless of that, nothing stops us from doing some gaming on this little chip. A quick mention before the benchmarks goes out to the cooler for today's testing. This is actually a more than 15-year-old cooler from an old AMD system with pretty much the same mounting mechanism. Therefore, it will be great for today's testing and cooling this small beast. Not that the box cooler couldn't do the job. After all, the Athlon only consumes 35 watts, maybe even a passive cooling system could be used here. Before we test out some actual gaming, I did some Cinebench benchmarks, and the 200GE doesn't really shine in these, although it may be worth noting that it's doing significantly better than the AMD's X4 950, also an AM4 CPU with supposedly 4 cores and 4 threads, based more on the older generation of Athlons, hence why the weaker score. On the other hand, the 200GE falls behind even on a 4th gen Core i3, which has the same layout of a hyper-threaded 2-core setup, and the Intel chip is quite a bit better in both single and multi-core benchmarks. Elden Ring is the first title on the benchmark list, and immediately, the weakness of the Athlon CPU comes into play. As you can see, the CPU usage doesn't drop below 80%, it produces inevitable stutters and frame drops, with a pretty bad average frame rate of less than 30 FPS. Not really a great start for the Athlon CPU to say the least. The newest title for the benchmark list is the Resident Evil 4 remake, and although the Athlon is really pushing it with a usage of a constant 100%, it delivers much better FPS than in Elden Ring, although stutters and frame drops are inevitable in any new game with the CPU and only the 2 cores that it has. A pretty similar story to Elden Ring is Dying Light 2. I mean, it's not a terrible experience. Maybe you could get by with this kind of performance, but you would be wasting a lot of GPU potential. As you can see, the Athlon is a bottleneck for even the RX 570. A stronger GPU wouldn't really make sense and wouldn't provide a huge difference. The Athlon is just too weak to handle newer games. Far Cry is one of the series that from my experience always did well on the dual-core CPUs with 4 threads. Far Cry 6 also doing decently, but as noticeable by footage and the percentile figures, the game does tend to stutter a lot. But that's nothing new considering the previous game results. You may think that esports titles can be the saving grace for this CPU, and that the 200GE could handle them remotely well, but as it seems, the online component of newer titles really isn't something for this CPU, and it's too little cores. No amount of tweaking the settings can fix this. The game stays unplayable no matter what you try. I remember the days when the CPU was a decent recommendation for a budget-oriented esports gamer, but as you can see, those days are numbered. Ultimately, no one really expected the budget-oriented CPU from 2018 to do well 5 years later. Certainly not with the 2 cores it was given. That was ultimately its death sentence, and we all knew that even when it was released. On the used market, I paid just $15 for this CPU, and when paired with an A320 board, decent amount of RAM, and an SSD, everyday tasks can be done with ease. That's pretty much the only use case I can think of for this CPU in 2023. But the only thing going for it is its integrated GPU. This CPU especially doesn't make sense when considering that the 1st gen Ryzen 5s are going for less than $30 on AliExpress. And needless to say, those are by far a better choice, despite being considered old CPUs. They can definitely still offer some value for gaming, even in 2023. Thank you very much for joining me on this look back at the Athlon 200GE, which wasn't really shining to say the least. So consider subscribing to not miss out on my future projects.